In rural France, Virginie takes care of her late husband's locust farm all day, and sometimes even at night. She has invested everything in it because it's her sole source of livelihood, and she needs to feed her 2 children, Laura and Gaston. Locusts are raised for protein, but lately, Virginie's business has been declining because the locusts aren't reproducing in large numbers, and many of them die quickly. Virginie often seeks help on a locust breeders forum, but none of the suggestions have yielded significant results. Virginie is so obsessed with her business that she often doesn't have time for her children. When Gaston needs to be taken to soccer practice, she forces Laura to do it instead. Laura hates this not only because her mother should spend time with them, but also because being in public makes her a target for teenagers who mock her for living with insects. One afternoon, Virginie is visited by a potential customer who wants to buy locusts in large quantities for snacks. However, Virginie has only 4 out of the 6 crates she promised, so the man asks for a discount. Such a price is impossible for Virginie since she already sells locusts incredibly cheaply, so she refuses. Later, Virginie takes Laura with her to find fresh grass to feed the locusts. Laura asks about the customer and is very saddened to hear that the family is once again in financial crisis, which only increases her resentment toward the locust farm. Later, Virginie thinks a lot and ends up calling her friend Karim, who works as a vineyard keeper, to borrow money from him. Luckily, Karim agrees to help and keep the secret, but as soon as Virginie hangs up, Karim calls a few friends to see if they're interested in buying Virginie's products. The next day, Laura sees a video uploaded by one of her classmates in which they make fun of Laura and her family for living with disgusting insects, fueling her hatred for the farm. Meanwhile, Gaston also starts raising some locusts in a terrarium. When he accidentally injures his finger, one of his locusts lands on the wound to feed on it. In the afternoon, Virginie takes her children to the city, where she offers her locust snack products at various food stores. While Laura waits in the car, she sees the guy who posted that video to ridicule her. Laura confronts him, and a fight ensues, during which the boy lightly hits Laura in the face. Before things escalate further, Virginie intervenes and takes Laura away. When they get home, Virginie scolds Laura for her attitude, not listening when Laura explains that she feels like an outcast among others. Later, Virginie receives a call from a customer who wants to buy a large quantity of locusts but offers a very low price. Virginie promises to think about it. She then checks on Laura and, seeing her state, decides that she needs to do something. She tells her daughter that she will sell everything to the customer who just called so they can move and start a new life, which makes Laura very happy. The next day at school, Virginie approaches the guy from the video to tell him that they will leave soon, and she won't have to see his ugly face anymore. A few moments later, the customer comes to the farm to finalize the deal, but he becomes extremely disappointed when he sees that Virginie's locusts are very thin and lowers the price significantly. This infuriates Virginie, and she pushes the crates out of the man's car, refusing to sell. Her mood worsens when the man reveals that he came only because Karim asked him to, and Virginie realizes that people have been buying from her out of pity. Unable to cope with the situation, Virginie goes to the locust tent and starts destroying everything. Suddenly, she slips and falls, injuring herself and losing consciousness. When she finally wakes up, she is horrified to find that the locusts are feeding on her blood, and she quickly runs outside. A few moments later, the neighbor comes to retrieve his dog, who likes to sneak into her property. Meanwhile, Virginie meets with Karim and tells him she doesn't want his pity. When he asks her about the wound on her arm, she lies about it and leaves. When she returns home, Virginie hears the locusts making a strange noise and checks on them. She discovers that the locusts have become more energetic, which leads her to think about the cause. The next morning, the locusts continue to be extremely noisy, and Virginie wonders if it's because they tasted blood. She tests her theory by removing the bandage from her arm and introducing it into the cage, where the locusts immediately swarm to feed on it. Virginie endures the pain for the sake of science, and afterward, she hides in the bathroom to remove all the locust parts from her wound. That night, she and Gaston can hear how loud the locusts are inside the house. The next morning, Virginie puts on special protective clothing before entering the cage to avoid another feeding session. She is surprised to discover that not only have the locusts fattened up, but they are also multiplying rapidly in large numbers. Excited that her project is finally flourishing, Virginie begins to build new tents with Karim's help. When Laura sees this, she becomes very upset because if her mother is expanding the business instead of selling it, it means she lied and they won't leave. On the other hand, Gaston is thrilled to see such large locusts and asks his mother for the secret. But Virginie tells Gaston that she fed them parsley. She allows Gaston to take a few of these locusts for his collection, but when he leaves a box with one of them on the table during dinner, Laura smashes it with her fist and accuses her mother of lying. An argument ensues, and when Virginie explains that she has debts to pay, Laura simply leaves the table. Meanwhile, in Gaston's terrarium, the new locusts eat the older ones. To make sure everything goes well, Virginia returns to the cage in the evening and offers her blood to the locusts to help them grow. Her presence, surrounded by insects, leaves her in a state of agitation that a bath can't resolve, so afterward, she goes to see Kareem, who has problems with his own harvest. The two of them share the challenges of being farmers. By the time the locusts are ready to be harvested, the final result is very fresh and generous, so Virginie returns to the customer to offer the product again. This time, the man is happy to buy at a reasonable price and wants more in the future. Back at the farm, the neighbor watches as more and more tents continue to appear, not knowing what to believe. Since it's impossible to constantly feed the locusts with her own blood, Virginie starts buying fresh blood bottles from the butcher, which she delivers directly to the farm. She mixes the blood with jelly powder to turn it into solid clots and then goes around the cages, leaving a clot in each one for the locusts to eat. The locusts multiply so rapidly that the noise becomes unbearable, and Laura has to play music incredibly loudly in her headphones to drown out the sound of the insects. She continues to help her mother with the business, but she notices that Virginie enters the tent every night, and this growing obsession begins to worry her. One afternoon, one of Laura's friends comes to visit, but when he asks if they are moving after all, Laura thinks he's making fun of her. Overwhelmed by anger and extremely annoyed by the constant noise of the locusts, Laura finally snaps. She goes into one of the tents and vents her frustration, breaking the cages and cutting one of the tent walls. Then she and her friend return home without discussing it. Meanwhile, Gaston waits in the car with his pet goat and is surprised to see some locusts on the window. Suddenly, a giant swarm of locusts flies out of the tent and attacks the car. He immediately hides under the seat, and while the car shakes, he calls his goat's name as the leash slips away. Soon, the locusts disappear, and Gaston comes out to find that his goat has also vanished. At that moment, Virginie returns from the city, and Gaston quickly runs to her, hysterically crying because his goat is missing. After checking the tent and telling the children to stay inside, Virginie goes to investigate, but finds the animal dead, with the locusts feeding on it. She moves the carcass to a safe place and then returns home, but tells Gaston that she found nothing while he cries in his room. Virginie scolds Laura for her behavior, dragging her forcefully into her room. Later, Virginie continues her lie, taking Gaston in her van to search for the goat. Desperate to mend her relationship with her children, Virginie decides to take them to the beach and have fun together. To distract Gaston from the loss of his goat, she allows him to go to soccer camp. Even under the scorching sun, Virginie doesn't swim with her children but keeps her clothes on to hide the scars from the locusts, which Laura notices. When they return home, Kareem is waiting with a scooter, which is his gift to Laura. Afterward, Kareem and Virginie share some wine and begin to kiss, but when he tries to lift her shirt, Virginie gets scared and tells him to leave. A few days later, Virginie contacts the butcher to get more fresh blood, but they have found out she doesn't have a license and won't sell to her anymore. She then tries a cattle farm, but they have a waiting list, and she can't wait that long. However, this doesn't stop her from expanding her farm even further, and she nearly cuts down Gaston's favorite tree to do so, but her son convinces her to stop. With no blood suppliers, Virginie starts using transfusion equipment to use her own blood, which weakens her. The next day, Kareem comes to visit, but Virginie is rude to him because she fears getting caught. She tells him not to come without calling first. Later, in the middle of the night, Virginie finds the neighbor's dog wandering around her farm, desperate not to lose her abundant harvest. She decides to feed the dog to the locusts. Inside the house, the locusts begin to multiply to the point where they overflow the sink and flood the vivarium, but this turns out to be Gaston's nightmare. The next morning, Virginie has to quickly clean up all the bloodstains left by the dog because more customers are coming to buy large quantities of locusts, which she can now provide. Later, in the middle of the night, Laura goes to kill a neighbor's farm animal and brings it to feed the locusts. The next day, Virginie is so weakened that she doesn't want to get out of bed, so Laura has to take Gaston to camp. When she returns, she searches for her mother and is shocked to find a lot of bloody clothes on the floor. Worried and confused, Laura goes to the farm and discovers a disturbing scene. Virginie is wearing only underwear, allowing the locusts to cover her body while crying in pain. Terrified, Laura immediately runs back into the house, locks herself in the bathroom, and ignores her mother calling her name while sending a message to Kareem asking him to come immediately. Until Kareem arrives, Virginie acts as if nothing happened. Kareem tries to ask her how she's feeling, but Virginie gives random answers and tries to avoid them. However, she is very weak and can barely walk, on the brink of fainting. Kareem catches her just before she falls and decides to take Virginie and Laura to his home for dinner and to watch a movie together. When Laura is alone in the kitchen, crying, Kareem goes to ask her what's wrong, and she tells him to check the cages. But before she can explain further, Virginie interrupts her and accuses Laura of meddling. Kareem asks her to behave better with her daughter, but she decides to leave. Meanwhile, the neighbor comes to the farm looking for his dog. He hears that the locusts are making more noise than usual and enters the tent, where he finds the dog's collar and too many locusts on the roof. Later, Kareem takes the girls home, but instead of leaving, he decides to check the mystery Laura referred to. When he enters the tent, he is shocked to discover that the locusts have killed the neighbor and are currently consuming him. Horrified and disturbed, Kareem takes quick action, setting a fire to burn all the tents with the locusts inside. At that moment, Virginie sees the fire and immediately runs outside to try to extinguish it. Kareem tries to stop her, but Virginie pushes him aside, and all the locusts come out of the tent and go after him. Kareem tries to escape into the house, but the locusts follow and block the window. Virginie tries to put out the fire when she hears Laura screaming and rushes inside, where she finds Kareem's lifeless body, being devoured by the locusts. Laura is not in the house, but has actually fled into the woods to avoid the locusts. Eventually, she reaches the lake and enters the water using an overturned boat to protect herself. However, the locusts quickly cover the boat and start pushing it into the water to drown Laura. At that moment, Virginie arrives, so desperate to save her daughter that she covers her own face with her own blood to attract the locusts. Her plan works, and soon the locusts cover her body to feed. When Laura no longer hears the locusts above her, she swims out from under the boat and sees her mother being attacked by the locusts, which don't let go until Virginie sinks into the water. As the insects fly away, Laura swims to her injured mother to help her. They embrace and watch as the locusts disappear while the sun rises on the horizon.